Yeah, if they don't care about you, well, you haven't signed a contract yet. I think you're kind of naive if you think that they're going to love you and treat you wonderfully once you do something.
Welcome to the License to Lead podcast. I'm Patty Fay. This podcast is for physicians or anyone who thinks healthcare needs a transformation led by physicians. License to Lead means that physicians are charged with and must be in charge of guiding the vision and the culture of healthcare systems. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the License to Lead podcast. This is Patty Fay. My guest today is attorney and author Dennis Hursh, who specializes in contracts and health law, and specifically in physician agreements or physician employment contracts. I first discovered Mr. Hursh when I read an article that he wrote for Kevin MD, which had a title that certainly caught my eye. The title was, "Are Hospitals Evil? A Physician Contract Lawyer Explains." Dennis Hursh is a frequent lecturer to residency and fellowship programs and keynote speaker for healthcare and physician groups, healthcare systems, and national conferences. He wrote an excellent book on physician contracts and potential pitfalls, and it's titled The Final Hurdle. I recommend it, and I think it should be required reading for anyone coming out of residency or fellowship and looking for their first professional position. I'm so glad Mr. Hursh is a guest on the show today. Hi, Dennis. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Patty. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm delighted to have you here. I'd love for you to start by letting us know what got you started working in physician contracting. Why that area of specialty?
Well, I'd love to say it was carefully planned, but it really wasn't. My first daughter was born with truncus arteriosus, what we now know is DeGeorge syndrome. They didn't have gene tests in those days, but the first 2 years of her life, we probably spent about 18 months in hospitals, mostly Children's Hospital in Philadelphia. And there was one particular evening, of the 3 times the physicians told me we've done all we can. The first one etched it in my brain, and I'll never forget that. She was in cardiac failure again, and she was about 6 pounds was her normal weight. At that time, she was 9 pounds, just bloated like a sausage and shiny skin. And they were doing everything. I mean, just the cocktails of drugs that they were putting into her. Overnight, there were 2 fellows that never left her bed. And this is in a very busy NICU, Children's Hospital in Philadelphia. They didn't have their own cardiac NICU then, so it was the NICU. Those 2 barely left her bedside. One cardiology fellow apologized. He said he needed to get sustenance, and he felt he needed to apologize for that. And he came back like not 10 minutes later holding a small salad, which I guess was what he could grab quickest downstairs. The 2 of them just working feverishly all night long without a break. It really made an influence on me, and they brought her through. At this point, she's over 30 and living in a group home and very happy. So it ended up being a happy ending, but I just was stunned that people could do that there were humans out there that were that concerned that would just stay by the bed all night long. While there was obviously a ton of other things to do, but their priority was their sickest patient. I wrote thank you notes to both of them. And I thought, boy, that about evens it out for saving a child's life. So I sent a letter of commendation to the hospital CEO, and it still didn't feel right. I just kind of felt like there was something I needed to do. I just decided then and there that these were pretty amazing people, and I was going to try and help them as much as I could. And that was almost 30 years ago. I'm still doing it.
That's a moving story. How did you make that shift in the work that you were doing?
Well, I was a business attorney at the time, and I was doing contracts and tax law largely. So I just started focusing more on physician agreements. I actually was involved with the State Medical Society for quite some time. They set up a subsidiary, and I was still working for physicians, but not employment agreements. And we set up physician organizations all around the state. So I got to know a lot of physicians. And I think that's where the employment contracts started coming in. As a physician, this probably doesn't sound at all unusual to you, but I was just shocked at professional with that kind of training and the contracts that they were getting and the requirements that were being put on them, it was shocking to see what a standard physician employment contract looks like. No executive would sign something and say, oh, yeah, by the way, twice a week, you're going to have to stay up for 24 hours. You still work the next day. From an outsider, it's like, what? They do what?
Yeah, I would love to hear more. What else did you notice that sort of bowled you over? It is fascinating to get that outside perspective on what we just take in stride to some degree.
Well, call coverage was one of the biggest ones. One of the things I would see would be a start date. And it's funny, you had somebody on your podcast with that HPEC, I believe, the idea of blockchain and your credentials are something you own.
Yes.
I have had so many physicians get tied up in that. You sign a contract in June, move your family, maybe take on a mortgage or a lot of rent, and you can't start the first day because the credential isn't all done. Either the hospital hasn't credentialed you or a major payer, or sometimes a relatively minor payer hasn't credentialed you yet. And the contract says if you're not fully credentialed by everybody, you can't start. And there are so many ways you can work around that, but the contract typically says you don't start. Sometimes they can unilaterally terminate the agreement. It's like, yeah, that one didn't come in yet. We're terminating you.
So sometimes that's written in. That's written in that if you're not credentialed by a certain time, that
we have the right to terminate you.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is nuts. And then restrictive covenants that's something you see in executives. But I think it's one thing if you're a potato chip manufacturer that your secret potato chip formula doesn't go over to a competitor. It's just shocking to me that I can't pick my physician because my physician has promised to move out of the area if they stop working there. Some of the, I consider crazy things in restrictive covenant. In my book, I talk about a 65-mile restrictive covenant that a physician signed. He wanted to work 63 miles away. We were quite certain it would never be enforced. No court would ever enforce that. But they still didn't hire him because there was a possibility the first employer would take you to court. So we'll hire somebody else that doesn't have potential litigation attached to them. So restrictive covenants, I think, are insane for physicians. I just don't think there should be one.
Is it shifting at all? Because I do think that that's a patient care issue and a patient rights issue. And it sounds like the one you just described, there was a 65-mile radius and the new job was 63 miles away.
Yeah, he wasn't going to bring any patients from 63 miles away. I think it's shifting a little, and some states are starting to put restrictions on restrictive covenants. But there's still a huge issue, and it's something that I always have to fight over. A lot of times, too, it's you can't practice medicine within the radius. So even if your office is outside, you can't practice medicine within this radius. And by a funny coincidence, the radius is drawn to include the major hospital in town. So basically, you can't practice in town. You have to move your family and get out of town or commute incredible distances. So I do see it.
So what do you recommend then when somebody comes to you with a contract, they're just out of fellowship and this is their first professional role? What do you look for and what do you recommend starting with these restrictive covenants?
Well, I think it, first of all, should be based on a reasonable area. And for most physicians, I think that's 5 miles. It can be less if you're in Manhattan. I have actually seen restrictive covenants in Manhattan of city blocks, like 5 city blocks, which I think is reasonable. Now, if you're in rural Montana and your patients are driving 30 miles for groceries, then maybe a 30-mile restrictive covenant isn't so crazy. But it should be based on your location where you were practicing. I see some now, these monstrous health systems that say you can't compete within 15 miles of any of our facilities. So someplace 40 miles away that you never set foot in, there's a circle drawn around that and you can't practice there. And they've never heard of you. I think it's just insane. And it also should relate to where your new location is. I've seen some that say you can't work for an employer that has any kind of operations within X miles of ours. So with these huge health systems, you can be 120 miles away for an employer that has a facility within the restricted area of the big employer you're working for now. So it's basically, it should be drawn from where you spent most of your time, and it should only relate to your new location, not practice of medicine or not where your employer is. And again, not where your current employer is.
What language would you zero in on and recommend often?
Well, I don't think longer than a year is generally reasonable. And I like 5 miles as a restrictive covenant. Again, if you're in a major city, I think it can be contracted. There are places and instances in which it might be reasonable. If you're a sub specialist, maybe it's reasonable to have a longer distance. The patients always travel a distance to that sub specialist. But in general, I like 5 miles from your location is where your new location is. And it's a period of 1 year. If it comes down to negotiating, I'm going to be more comfortable on a longer time period than I am on a bigger area. I mean, the fact is, if you have to leave for a year, you're out of the market. Patients are going to see another physician during that time. So a year, 2 years doesn't make that big a difference, but the mileage can be really critical.
Okay. And are they negotiable? If they've got 30 miles and a year, and somebody comes back and says 5 miles and 6 months, what's likely to happen? What are some of the possibilities there?
The deadly thing from every attorney is it depends. Some systems are really adamant that some big health systems won't change. Some are more flexible, and it really does depend on the system. I've had some that say, we don't change the restrictive covenant. Every physician has signed that. You must sign that. I used to represent a private practice that had 5 physicians working for it, and each one had a different restrictive covenant. It was just up to what you could negotiate. One of them had 10 miles and one of them had 3 miles.
Wow.
And it was the same practice, the same specialty. Yeah. A lot of times you just have to negotiate and see what you can get.
I guess we usually call these non-compete contracts or clauses, and you're referring to them as restrictive covenants, but same thing?
Same thing.
Okay. And when a physician receives an employment agreement from their potential employer, what would you recommend as the next 3 steps they should take?
Well, I'm a little biased since I make my living reviewing physician employment agreements, but I think you should get an experienced physician's attorney to look at it. I think one of the biggest things that they should be thinking about is it's a switch of mindset. To get where you are right now, that somebody's ready to hire you as a physician, you've been competitive your whole life, probably high school, college. You wanted to be the top resident. The match was competitive. And physicians tend to think that I'm still in a competition here. That's not true anymore. Once they've decided on you, you're the prize. They want you. Now, I'm not saying primary care physician can say, I want $2 million a year. It can't be crazy, but they've probably gone through a pool of applicants. They've spent a lot of expensive physician time vetting these. They've spent more physician time interviewing. They've got a lot invested already. If they paid a recruiter, it can be a huge amount of money. So they've got a lot of money invested right now to get you. Now, they may have a second choice, but they want you. And I see new physicians in particular, they look around and there's 30 other people in the room that have the same qualifications that they do. And they decide, oh, it's really competitive. You don't think about the country and how big it is and the physician shortage that we have. So I think one of the biggest things you got to focus on is your attitude. The competition's over. You're the prize now.
Wow, that's just such an excellent message. I think it's so important. And if they're not treated like the prize, that's a red flag.
Yeah.
If it's that plus they're not budging on any of the elements of the contract, maybe it's an indication that they should look elsewhere.
Yeah, if they don't care about you, well, you haven't signed a contract yet. I think you're kind of naive if you think that they're going to love you and treat you wonderfully once you do sign. I've actually had people say, well, we would never enforce that. Just brutal provisions in an employment agreement. And they just flat say, well, we would never enforce that. The question is, then why won't you take it out of the contract? The first question, why'd you put it in if you would never do it? And second question, why would you have any hesitation about removing it? And you always get this, flexibility. Yeah. That's what makes me crazy is they would not have put it in the agreement if they don't want the right to enforce it.
They might write it off to, oh, this is just something that our attorneys insist that we put in the contract. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
It's something corporate makes us put in there, but don't worry about it.
Yeah.
and do you have some examples of that, of things that you have recommended that your clients just don't sign this? If they don't take this out, don't sign it.
I've had a few. I don't think a physician should ever be on productivity compensation day one. That tells me that the employer is not certain they need a physician, but it's worth a risk. They'll spend a little money, spend a little time interviewing this physician. And if it doesn't work out, it's no big deal. And it isn't for the employer. They've protected it. We'll give you a percentage of what you bring in. So they're not bringing in much, but they're not paying you. They're covering their costs on you. You might be making $70,000 a year. As the employer, we're covering our costs. So in my mind, you have to guarantee salary for at least a year. You can't expect anybody to come in and just take the practice. Again, there's some exceptions. Dr. Smith is retiring. It's a small town. There's two of us. Okay, maybe it's agreeable, but I would still argue, so it sounds like a slam dunk. Why don't you guarantee the salary? If you think it's a slam dunk, guarantee the salary. I think that's one of the biggest things that I tend to say you really have to consider this very carefully.
And in that regard, they might guarantee a salary, say $200,000 a year, random number, but they might guarantee that salary. But if the physician has a brisk practice, they'll be covering it themselves. So it's not as if they're doubling up on it, like they're getting the guaranteed salary plus what they're creating with their productivity. Is that right?
Correct. To me, as a physician, you have to trust that if they brought you in, that there's enough for you to do to earn a reasonable living. Another thing I've seen is a practice that was recruiting people and saying, we're paying you about half of MGMA, but as soon as you cover your salary with collections, we'll make you a partner. We don't put that in the agreement, though.
Oh.
So what I'm hearing is you want this person to work for half price. And maybe in 6 months, maybe you'll make that person a partner. And then they show you all the partners, and partners are doing very well. That was one of the biggest battles I had. And it just happened recently. They sent out a separate document that says, this is how it will work. And it was a huge battle to get them to incorporate that into the agreement. Every agreement has what a lawyer calls an integration clause. And it basically says, if it isn't in the contract, it doesn't exist. Anything that you heard we talked about, any writings, anything that isn't in this contract doesn't exist and is of no force or effect. So that's another thing I see all the time, that this piece of paper over here explains the way it's going to work, but sign this document.
I imagine that you see physicians a little reticent to be very challenging to their future employer. And how do you work through that reticence to really insist on having the contract shipshape?
I always, again, point out that they're the prize now, that they really do want you. And I do think, and again, I'm biased, this is what I do, but I think it helps to have an attorney involved. The way I do it is I always write a letter to the physician saying, these are my issues. And that way it's Dennis that's asking for everything. You're not really asking for anything. So I think you can do that and just say, this is really important to me. I really want to stay here. I really want to get started on the right foot. So I invested in an attorney. It's that important to me. And here's what the attorney said. And I think if they think about that, that means that you're not juggling 7 offers and trying to get the best deal, unless you're independently wealthy. If you hired an attorney to review this agreement, you're probably pretty serious. And I've actually had, when I was representing that same private practice, had the managing partner say to me, she must be serious. She's hired an attorney. It was viewed as a good thing. She's not messing with us. She really is going to come here.
I think this is just critical. I think it's frightening, really, to think about a physician coming out of training and not getting an attorney. And that's pretty disconcerting. That language can be deliberately obfuscating. You don't really know what all the implications are of the language. And how about the particular skill? You mentioned a physician contract attorney. And can you say more about why that would be important?
Well, I think there's issues that you have to know what physicians are doing fairly deeply. I mean, call coverage. You want somebody that at least has access to the MGMA data bank, for instance, which is pretty expensive. If you're doing a couple of contracts a year for a physician, you certainly wouldn't invest in that kind of money. And MGMA tells you things like call coverage, hours per week. And then if it goes over those hours per week, what's the median compensation? So a lot of those things that I think you almost have to know it's out there. Physicians do get paid for call. The contract does say it's included in your compensation, but not only should they get paid, but you should have parameters around it. It shouldn't be, well, there's 4 of us and we split it equally. Oh, guess what? The hospital across town recruited 3 of them and now you're doing 24/7. So putting parameters in, putting compensation in for call coverage. And I think a lot of other issues. I've gotten some people out of potential Stark issues because the employer didn't have a specialized attorney. I had one where if the new physician rounds at the hospital, they would give that physician all the revenue from any labs that were ordered.
Oh,
Which, I mean, in any other business, we don't pay you for it. But the labs that you do, we make money and you get that because you were the one that went to the hospital. I mean, it's very reasonable. But of course, a regulator would look at that and say, yes, you're paying for referrals. Those are the kind of things that the employer handed it to them and said, here you go. Our attorney prepared this. And it could have been pretty bad for both sides.
and can you explain the Stark laws?
Basically, it comes down to you can't pay for a referral. And that sounds obvious enough. A specialist can't say, hey, primary care physician, I'll give you $50 for every patient you send me. That's easy enough to see. But the Stark regs I have in my drawer, I'm going to say they're about 4 inches thick, the latest regs. Because people can be wily, they try and shut down every possible thing. If you're in a venture together, we have to very carefully look at the fair market value that what you sell it to. Because the idea being, hey, primary care physician, we have an ambulatory surgery center. We'll sell you, 10% for $1. And oh, by the way, I suppose you're probably going to refer your patients here now since you're an owner. Things like that. Just a whole lot of ways that you can get around Stark. And it makes the regulations really, really complex. And again, for a hospital, you would expect that it would comply with Stark. But I actually had a case where a small hospital was doing something that didn't comply with the latest regulations. And I had to say, hey, you should talk to your attorney about this. Maybe it's time to update this agreement. There are some traps sometimes that I think it helps to have a specialized physician's attorney.
Yes, I listened to your book on audio. You mentioned in there that with every physician contract that you work through, a contract attorney learns a little bit more and has more content knowledge, has more expertise for the next physician agreement that they're working on. It's sort of simple and obvious, but I think just so important for physicians to realize that there can be quite a difference, and probably compare it to our own field where it does matter. If you've got a challenging cardiac problem, it does matter if that person is seeing a cardiologist. It matters to have that additional training.
And with attorneys, it's much worse. I mean, physicians tend to think, well, I'm a cardiologist, so that means I had 3 years of training after I got my MD and I'm board certified and I've done this. Right now, in my profession, I could decide that I want to do airplane torts, mass torts. If an airplane crashes, that I can go to court and sue. Now, I've never been in court. I've never handled a tort case, but attorneys don't really have the kind of regulations that physicians do. If I go to a cardiologist, I'm pretty sure that that person has a really good background in cardiology. If you go to an attorney, you have no idea if that person's ever done a physician contract before or ever done any employment contract before. If you look in the yellow pages, you see we do wills, corporations, estates, trusts. We do it all. So I think it's important.
I think that really makes that argument for how many times have they been around this block? What is their actual experience and expertise? It relies more on the experience, it sounds like. the years of doing it and the number of contracts you've done as opposed to any like specialty specific training that you'd get.
Right, because there's basically none for attorneys.
Okay. So are there other things that you'd like to highlight about contracts before I ask you a little bit about the article that I read on Kevin MD that you'd written? Anything else that jumps out that would be important to give docs a heads up on?
You look at tail coverage. That's something that I've had so many people trapped by, that the practice, it's usually private practices, but the practice has claims made insurance, and you go to leave and now you must purchase a tail, and the tail can be extraordinarily expensive. I mean, I've seen as much as a third of a year's salary. I have a friend, a physician, and she was worried about a restrictive covenant. Well, it was 10 miles or something. She moved across the state, and her last day, the practice manager said, oh, by the way, we're going to need proof of your tail. And she didn't even know what tail was. And so they hooked her up with the broker, and it ended up, luckily, her parents were able to lend them some money, but it was a huge amount of money, and they ended up borrowing money from her parents. It's just not something she thought about.
And what would that language look like? I think you said they had claims made approach in the contract. What else could it be?
That's the thing, is you always have to inquire. It doesn't necessarily say. It should say that we will purchase tail coverage. A lot of times it says we will provide malpractice insurance while you're working here, or we will provide malpractice coverage, which is fine. So you wouldn't know until the end when they said, oh, by the way, we did our bit. We provided coverage. Now you're leaving. Now you have to buy the tail. There's two kinds of malpractice insurance. There's occurrence and claims made. Occurrence insurance means if the claim is based on something that occurred during the policy period, the insurance company covers it. Claims made means the claim has to be made during the policy period. So if you leave December 31st and you get a claim that was based on something that happened in July, but the claim isn't filed until March of the next year, under claims made, you're not covered. The claim was made after the policy ended. So that's why you need tail coverage. And again, the language usually doesn't say something like, we don't pay tail coverage. It frequently says, we will provide insurance while you're employed. So you need to take that extra step and say, hey, it needs to specify that if you have claims made, that you will pay the tail.
Okay, so it needs to either say that the malpractice coverage is occurrence coverage, or it has to be very clear that there is tail coverage in the employment contract that a physician signs before they start work someplace.
Right. And I usually go further and say, if you switch from occurrence to claims made, then you will pay the tail, because it's not good enough. If they say, oh, don't worry, we have occurrence insurance, claims made is a lot cheaper. And at some point, the practice manager may say, we can save a lot of money by switching over to claims made. And so they have to agree that we will pay tail if we ever move to claims made.
I'm curious, in the legal profession, if lawyers run into the issue with non-competes, is there a parallel there?
Not at all. Lawyers ethically say that a client has the right to choose their attorney. So lawyers cannot impose a covenant not to compete. Now, having said that, the big firms have ways around it. They say if you take any of the firm's clients or you practice law within X miles, you don't get your capital contribution back. Of course, you can still do it, but it's going to cost a lot of money. But in general, you cannot prohibit a lawyer from competing at all.
How did this happen in medicine? It seems so anti-patient. The patient should have a right to have the continuity of care. That's a quality issue for patients.
Well, I think a lot of it started coming in when the hospitals began employing more physicians, because physicians tend to think of other physicians as colleagues. I'm a cardiologist. I have colleagues across town that are cardiologists. They don't think in terms of, and I've got a competing group across town. It's just not usually the way physicians think. Hospitals, however, are just crazy on competition. And I think they were the ones that started coming in and saying, well, we don't want this member of the workforce. That's my favorite term. They're not humans. We have a workforce. We don't have people working for us. We have a workforce.
Not professionals, not physicians who have done 20,000 hours of phenomenal training and work.
No.
But yeah, the workforce.
The workforce. Some of them clean toilets. Some of them wear white coats. They're all our employees as far as we're concerned. But I think they were the ones that started coming in and really insisting on it and enforcing it. And I will say, you can't just totally say non-competes are horrible. I always give the example, if you're coming in as a new physician, those patients you're seeing probably didn't come to see you. I called up my physician and they said, Dr. Smith can see you in 3 weeks, but we have a new physician. Would you like to see her? I'm going to say, yes, I would like to see her. But I didn't come to see her. I didn't hear in the paper that this wonderfully trained physician who was top match and all this stuff. I wanted to see Doc Smith, who I've always seen, but I kind of got shuffled over to this physician. Now, eventually, that physician is going to be my physician, but that loyalty really did come from Doc Smith, from the old doctor that was there. So it's not totally unreasonable. They've introduced you to all these patients that they have some protection. And I think, again, we're talking business. Physicians don't think in those terms. Physicians think you're a colleague. If you go practice somewhere, that's great. We're still colleagues generally. But hospitals just say, we don't want you working for a competitor.
Maybe that brings us to the article that you wrote that I spotted on Kevin MD, and it was titled, Are Hospitals Evil? And can you talk a little bit about that? I'm curious about the title, where that came from, and then what led you to write the article?
I'm tempted to say the answer is generally yes, but I think I've just had so many bad run-ins with hospitals where they just explain to you that the reason we need flexibility in our physician force. So we need the ability to assign physicians wherever. We cover a 300-mile radius, but we don't want to put in the agreement that when we talked, we said you were going to be here at Smithville. We said that, and we said we expect you to be there, but we need flexibility. So the contract will say you will see patients at Smithville and such other locations as we designate. And see, we need that because we need flexibility. The fact that maybe the physician is buying a house and doesn't want to be 300 miles, sent 300 miles away to a clinic, really doesn't enter into it. Again, it's flexibility of the workforce. I had the longest discussion, and it gets back to we would never do that. There's a large health system. One of the conditions that they can terminate you instantly is if they determine that you're disabled. So what that means is if you're in a bad car accident Thursday night, they can walk into the ICU, take a look at you and say, she's not going to work in 90 days. You're fired. And most places will pay a physician during some period of disability. And I brought that up and just kept repeatedly saying, well, we would never do that. We would never do that. And this is the general counsel of the hospital. It was just the lawyer telling me we would never do that. It's okay. It's like, it's not okay.
They had in the contract that they could terminate the physician if they determined that the physician was disabled.
Mm-hmm. Immediate termination. And not just disabled. I mean, there was some guardrails around it. Like if we determine that you will not be able to perform your services in 90 days. So it wasn't just, oh, that's a bad hangnail. We're terminating you. But still, as I said, they literally could walk into the ICU the day after the accident and say, yeah, she's not coming back in 90 days. When she regains consciousness, tell her she's fired. To be told over and over again, we would never do that. And they don't change. I've negotiated many times with that system and they don't change that. It's gotten to the point that the general counsel and I just have stopped arguing about it because it's banging your head into the wall.
Wow.
A lot of things like that. The thing that's gotten me recently is I had a hospital tell me that when I asked for 32 patient contact hours a week, they said, fine, we can make her part-time.
Oh, mm-hmm.
Yeah. I just was saying, no, wait, do you have an EHR? Their view was 40 patient contact hours a week is full-time. Anything less than that is part-time. Now, the hours that physicians spend working on EHRs and things. I've talked to one physician that said pretty much every night he would see patients till 5. He'd get home at 6, eat something, and be working at the computer till 11, just getting the EHR up to snuff, and then do it, start again the next day. So I don't think it's too much to ask for 8 hours a week where you have some admin time to do that. Maybe a couple of nights a week, you don't need to stay up late getting the EHR together. I think that was what put me over the edge. The 32 hours is part-time.
Yeah. It makes me think about the support issue. What have you noticed as far as the level of support that physicians are getting for their practice?
Not very much. The minimum that we possibly can. Why pay for a scribe? The physician can do that. When you get it all the time. And the answer is, why can't I get a scribe? Because we don't give it to the other physicians. That makes it all right. If we walked in and punched one of the physicians in the nose, that's just what we do. We're not discriminating against you in any way. We do this to everybody.
Right.
And that seems like a valid reason why they would deny a scribe. Just the short-sightedness is crazy. Things like a scribe are perfect example. Think how much patient satisfaction would go up if you sat and looked your physician in the eye for the entire meeting, instead of, I have great physicians myself, but always they look at you, they turn, they get it in the box. They look at you, they turn and get it into the box. And I know what they're doing, but I wonder how many people think, is he on Facebook or what's he doing over there, So I just think patient satisfaction would soar. The idea that if physicians could go home at night and just go home, see patients all day, do their very best, and assuming you don't have call, just go home. Mm-hmm. I mean, that seems like such an unreasonable thing to ask. But the fact is, no, everybody does it. Everybody works on the EHR at home. Again, we're not discriminating against you. That's what all our physicians do.
Or heaven forbid, if we gave you a scribe, we'd have to give everybody a scribe.
Exactly.
It's like, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, then every patient would be satisfied.
Yes.
I've got to tell you that I was so agitated at hospitals that I got the brainstorm. I was going to get a booth at the American Hospital Association Leadership and Trustee Conference in San Diego.
A booth?
Booth, yes. So that I could just grab people and talk to them about physicians. And it seemed like a good idea. And then the more I thought about it, it's like, no, if you're into gun control, probably don't give a lot of money to the National Rifle Association and figure you're going to change their minds at their meeting. But it seemed like a good idea at the time. So I went forward and was asking about sponsorship, how you get a booth. And because of that, I got on their mailing list. And you were just talking about burnout. Classic example. One of the things they sent me was their environmental scan for 2022 for hospitals. One of the first things it talks about is supply chain shortages. They're prevalent. Under it, top strategies for resilience and agility. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 bullet points telling what you can do about this problem.
So this is the American Hospital Association, and you ended up on their mailing list, and now you've got their 2022 strategy.
Right. And so, as I said, one of the first things is the supply chain, and that's a problem. So we've got 5 bullets of what people investing now or will invest within 2 years of the 5 things that people are investing in. That's on page 5. You get to page 10, physicians frequently experience feelings of burnout, 61%. Think about that for a minute. And then it breaks it out between male and female, younger than 46 and older than 46. And then we go to the next issue.
They describe it, they give the data, but they don't have any strategies the way they did with the...
Yeah. Like in other news, it's going to be dark tonight.
No big budget to focus on that particular part of the workforce.
No, that's different than supply chain. No, for physicians, that's just the way it is. 61% of them are experiencing feelings of burnout, according to the Hospital Association. But that's the end of that. Then we go on to the next thing. No strategies. Nobody's planning on investing. What are we going to do about this? No.
Yeah, man, Dennis. I mean, it sounds like you have really had your eyes on this and have a lot of empathy for what's going on with physicians. And What's the deal? Why are physicians in such a pickle with their profession and their ability to practice medicine?
Right. As I said, in other news, it's going to be dark tonight. That's the way it is. Physicians are all burned out. Why should we worry? It's because the person that goes to all that schooling and spends all those years dedicating their life to treating patients, they're going to take care of their patient always and forever. If I'm a hospital exec and I've invested in an expensive MRI machine, I got to make sure that thing's maintained. If it breaks down, everything stops. So I'll make sure that I'm scheduling that MRI so that I don't burn it out because it's expensive. Now let's flip. If I've got an expensive physician I'm paying a salary to, I don't have to worry about that. I can schedule them. I can pack patients in every 12 minutes from 8 to 5. It's not like an MRI. The shift goes off and that's it. If there's patients in the waiting room, that physician will see them. No matter how many I give, if I say 12 minutes, we may have some dissatisfaction because the physician is going to spend more than 12 minutes with that patient, but the physician will do it. The physician will just keep seeing patients, will literally work until they drop. And I don't have to worry about physicians. And I don't know what I can say to fix that. I never suggest that at 5 o'clock you say there's patients in the waiting room, tough, it's 5 o'clock. No physician ever would do that. But I think that's the whole problem is physicians are so professional that you can always count on them. You can always overload them. It's not like a machine that only has so much and then it'll break or you have to do maintenance. Physician, you just keep burning them out. And the wonderful thing about it, that's air quotes on that, is if you do burn one out, you just put that work on all the others. It's not like an MRI. It's down and the other MRI machine can only do so much. If you've got 4 physicians and one of them just totally burns out and retires early, you just put those patients on the other 4. That's all. I mean, there'll be a longer waiting line and things like that, but you can just keep piling it on. And the physicians will just keep treating those patients and doing the very best they can. So it's a tough place to be.
The risk of burnout is certainly clearly on the physician's shoulders, and the deep disappointment of what the career, what the profession has turned into is on the physician's shoulders and in their heart, but also the liability.
You had 12 minutes to see me and you didn't figure this out. In 12 minutes, there's an argument you've committed malpractice. Now, would you have found it if you had even 15 minutes maybe, or 20 minutes, or maybe you really would have liked a half an hour? Because, I'm chatty and say, oh, it's raining outside. And, you're watching the clock tick and saying there's patients waiting. Stop acting like we're 2 humans interacting here. This is an assembly line. Yeah, it shoves the risk onto physicians. And again, the problem is physicians just keep taking it. Consummate professionals, and no matter what you pile on them, they tend to just keep going.
I will often say that the hospitals are utterly reliant on the physician license. It's the physician's license that allows patients to be seen and care to be delivered in whatever setting patients are showing up. And that is where the authority is for the privilege of seeing patients. And yet somehow the physicians don't have the autonomy and authority to be managing their own profession when they're in these situations. And do you agree that the bottom line is it's the physician's license that allows patients to be seen, and that's where the leverage or the turnaround needs to begin?
Well, but leverage is a funny term. A lever is only good if you're willing to use it. So, what are you going to look me in the eye and say, you need my license, so any patient is here past 5, I'm just going to go home. Said no physician ever. And that's the problem. Yeah, I need your license, but I know you're going to continue giving superb patient care no matter how much I overload you until I either burn you out or you find someplace that seems to be a little bit better. So yeah, it's leverage, but again, the problem is it tends to be kind of an empty threat. It's sort of like saying, I've got a bomb here and I'm going to drop it in the room if you do this. Like, no, you're not.
Right. We're really fully realizing all the risks that are described when the bans on corporate practice of medicine were put in place. around the country with exactly this sort of language related to physicians should not be in a situation where their fiduciary responsibility to patients, their relationship with the patient is compromised or usurped by their commitment to an employer or to another business entity. What the heck has happened there? How has it happened that corporate practice of medicine bans have been so comprehensively circumvented?
Well, the ban exists, the idea being that you want a physician to have independent judgment on patients. I mean, that's the rationale for all of them. So it's pathetic, and I'm embarrassed to say this from the attorney's perspective, but most physician employment agreements now say the parties agree that you have complete independent judgment and the relationship of physician to patient shall not be disturbed. So you look at corporate medicine, you say, see, we covered it. And it says right in the contract that it's independent judgment. And how are you going to fight that? A lot of employment agreements also say you can't do a class action on this employment agreement. So your only option would be for you personally to sue the hospital and say, in fact, you're breaching the agreement. I don't actually have independent judgment because this, and this. First of all, who has the money laying around to individually fund a lawsuit? And the contract says you do. So you've got to prove that, in fact, you didn't. It's just a tough road to hoe, I think.
So you're saying that almost every employment agreement, and I agree, this is what I've seen as well, is they say that the physician has independent judgment and is fully in charge, fully in control of all patient care decisions.
Yeah.
And yet they're on an assembly line. They don't have the right to choose a high quality staff person to be working with. They don't choose their own staff. They don't choose the number of minutes that they can spend with a patient. And it's really a sham. That language in the contract is just an utter sham.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is. In the very strictest sense, if I'm sitting across from you as a physician, you have independent judgment as to, presumably nobody's going to say, no, he doesn't need an operation, something like that. Maybe the payer will, but nobody in the hospital is going to say, no, he doesn't need that. So as between me, the patient, and you, the physician, that's true. The problem is that, as you said, that doesn't count the fact that you have 12 minutes to see me and figure out what's wrong with me before they're bringing in the next patient. And I think that's the problem. It's very narrowly construed that as to the patient, you have complete independent judgment.
Right.
As to everything else in your working life, no.
Right. Or even just the burnout level, which creates this threat state. It's basically a high stress state that reduces your ability to use your prefrontal cortex when you're in a threat state. And the prefrontal cortex is pretty much a requirement, pretty much needs to be employed when dealing with patients. And yet it's very much compromised in somebody who has burnout or is even somebody that doesn't have a chronic burnout state. If they're in an acutely stressed state, they've got less capacity to think, which is really what physicians do. And that is severely compromised by the work expectations that employed physicians are under.
But don't worry, they'll give a free yoga class.
Yes.
We're not going to do less patient hours, but we will give you a free yoga class. So we're all over it.
Mandate a wellness seminar every Friday evening.
Yeah, that's right.
I wonder if you've got some thoughts about how the public sees this. Do you think the public understands the predicament that physicians are in?
I don't, because again, just the consummate professionalism. You just come in and you see the patient, you do the very best you can, and they see a human who is doing the very best they can. They don't see the pressures you're under. I mean, I've never had I'm very close to my primary care physician. We're friends before she got out of residency. So her and I have discussed it. But in general, a physician is not going to say, there's an assembly line here. I got 12 minutes with you. It's killing me. It's very professional, very concerned about me. And so, no, I don't think the public really does have a clue of the pressures that physicians are under.
I talk about the business school mindset, really profits over patients, just this idea coming out of business schools, the ideology of winning and making money, making a profit, improving my position in the organization. That is the rational egoism that I talk about as one of the kind of sine qua nons of the business school mindset, the idea that it's not rational unless I'm being self-centered. And I'm not making this up. This is stuff that I've read from the professors within the business schools that are despondent about what's being perpetrated there. And I'm wondering if that's something that you've seen or if you've got any thoughts on what I've called the business school mindset.
Yeah, I really do. And you would think the first mission would be quality care. And then we have to survive. No money, no mission is what the nonprofit hospitals always say. But in fact, competition is everything. I was involved in an imaging center not too far from here. To get to the hospital's imaging center, you park in the parking lot, you walk a couple hundred yards, you get into the lobby, you take the first elevator on the right, go up to the fourth floor, then you cross over to the sixth floor and it's this huge aggravation. So a physician set up an imaging center in a new business park. Everything's handicap accessible and park your car right in front of the door and walk in and you're treated, like a human. And it was wonderful. Well, the hospital came in and they paid, actually, I heard twice the listing price. There was under contract and the hospital came in. The imaging center was in the middle of the business park. The hospital bought the lot at the entrance to the business park. And guess what they put in there?
Oh, an imaging center.
An imaging center. Yep. Even though they had the imaging capability in the hospital. Now, it didn't improve the quality of care in any way, shape, or form because there was an imaging center 100 yards away and there was an imaging center in the hospital. It was just pure, we're going to put these people out of business. A local orthopedic group here set up an orthopedic hospital, and the hospital brought in 7 orthopedic surgeons, hired them pretty much all at once, and sat them there, told all their primary care physicians, you will now refer only to these physicians. Now, there was no need for 7 more orthopedic surgeons. It's a relatively small town. It was just pure hardball business, not quality of care. It's not anything else. It's hardball business. I think about the little old lady, the blue-haired lady who scrimped and saved all her life and managed to save up $30,000 when she died and left it to the hospital. And you wonder what that person would think about paying twice the asking price of the lot and putting in a multi-million-dollar imaging center that wasn't used just to teach physicians a lesson about who's in charge here. I have to think that all those charitable contribution people might have been just a little put off by that mindset.
If they knew the underbelly, if they knew the shenanigans and the politics going on and the outright rancor actually towards physicians, that's something that we haven't talked about, but I feel like it's something that I've seen where there is a disdain for physicians. Is that anything you've run into?
Absolutely. Prima donnas is the term you hear. They're all prima donnas. They want a scribe, or she wants a scribe. Nobody else has a scribe. That's proof that she's a prima donna. That's what that proves. Nothing. Maybe she's concerned about quality of care. Maybe she wants to do better. No, anything you ask for is proof that you're a prima donna. So yeah, there is tremendous disdain. And as I said, physicians in some places are part of the workforce. Some people clean the toilets. Some people operate on hearts, but it's all the workforce. And
right.
Why one group thinks they should be treated differently than the other group is just a mystery to the executives.
You mentioned that orthopedic group. You've got me curious what happened. So you've got an orthopedic group that set up their surgical center, and then the hospital brings in 7 brand new, no current business orthopedic surgeons. What happened?
It was very ugly for a while. Ultimately, I think the hospital requires its physicians, its employed physicians, to refer only to those people. But the orthopedic hospital is doing very, very, very well. This orthopedic hospital is run by physicians. So patient care really is very obvious, and everything they do is geared towards the patient. Whereas, yes, I may go to the employed physician at the hospital, but I'm going to be in the hospital OR. I'm going to go through all the indignities and everything else that everybody else does. I'll come in 3 hours early and so that the nurses and everybody can come in, and it depends on the shifts. If you go to the physician-owned orthopedic hospital, I've heard people say it's like I was royalty. It's these people.
Royalty.
Yeah, well, because you're just not used to it in the healthcare system. I was treated like a person. They were concerned about what I wanted. My schedule was important. I mean, who ever heard of that in healthcare?
Yes, I'm such a big proponent. It's really the reason for the name of my podcast, License to Lead. I believe that physicians should be leading healthcare and at every level throughout the hospitals and healthcare systems. And that when physicians lead, the quality is extraordinary. I mean, the best hospitals on the entire planet have been deemed to be Mayo Clinic and Cleveland Clinic, both of which have been physician-led since their inception. You'll really enjoy listening to my podcast interview with Dr. Keith Smith from the Surgical Center of Oklahoma. 20 plus years ago, he and an anesthesiologist partner left the hospital and started their own surgical center. And they don't take any insurance and they don't take any Medicare or Medicaid. And people come from all over the world to have their surgery there. And people with insurance go there and have their surgery because the surgery is cheaper than their co-insurance payment. And it's extraordinary. They have no turnover. Everybody's happy. I mean, it's exactly what you're describing with this orthopedic center that you just mentioned.
I've got to tell you, talking about my daughter, Rachel, again, her fourth open heart surgery, Dr. Norwood, a brilliant pediatric cardiovascular surgeon, moved to a clinic in Switzerland. And it was $25,000 for everything for open heart surgery. And that included flying the patient and the parents in, room and board there, any x-rays, anything. It was all included. And it struck me because I think her fourth operation cost in total $25,000. Her first one, I believe, was around $550,000, as I recall, counting the hospitalization. Yeah, I mean, physicians really can be very efficient and they know what's needed for patient care and do it.
And they cut out all the middlemen. There's just no need to be saying that a surgery is $100,000 so you can discount it down to $20,000 and then get some kind of bonus for having discounted it. And then it actually costs $3,500 in reality. And the hospital just makes out like bandits with this.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think what is maybe the most intriguing about that is the whole idea that we're going to bring in experts. We're going to bring in somebody with an MBA or some business degree so that they can run it like a business. And that's what we've got. We've got healthcare being run like a business. And I don't know if it's the correct use of the word irony that these business folks don't understand that you have to take care of people. There's got to be a certain level of equity and fairness in how you bill people. And I guess it's just the idea that these are the business people. And I can't even imagine a system or a sector that's more messed up than healthcare.
I should point out that $25,000 was early 90s. Still would be a stunning figure today, but it would obviously be more today. But I mean, $550.
Yeah. And I can't even quite do the math. Is that about 1/20th of the first surgery?
Yep.
All inclusive.
Well, I was contacted by BNA, a business thing, that was saying there was a big case now where a physician misdiagnosed somebody that had recently been to Nigeria and had this really strange disease, and somehow the physician missed it. And the question was, so do we need to train our physicians more on these unique and rare diseases? And the answer is no. You need to give them time to do their job. That's all you need. Our physicians are very well trained. Now, would the primary care physician have hit that diagnosis instantly? Probably not. But that primary care physician had the time to speak and really talk about symptoms and say, oh, how you been? Or you're person, oh, I just got back from Nigeria. In 12 minutes, you don't want to chit chat. It's boom, symptoms, what's history, doom. And so the issue isn't more training for physicians. Honestly, so many, I think, malpractice cases would never have occurred. The physician just had adequate time to use their training and do what they want to do, which is find a cure for their patient in front of them.
Well, I have to say, Dennis, I totally appreciate your advocacy and your stance when it comes to physicians and what physicians are about and the kind of support that they need. And I'm very glad that physicians have you in their corner to help with that first contract that they might be signing when they come out of training. So if somebody wanted to find you and see what you've written and see what you're all about, where should they go to get that information?
My law firm is named Physician Agreements Health Law. And so my website is pahealthlaw.com. And the book that we were talking about is The Final Hurdle. It's available on Amazon. It's available on Audible. It's available pretty much everywhere.
Okay. And I think you've done a lot of writing and blogging as well. And you do some public speaking and...
Yes. Physician Contract Law blog is also mine. So it's the same website.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. Really, really cool getting to know you and talk with you.
That was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the License to Lead podcast. Be sure to visit licensed2leadpodcast.com to join the conversation, access the show notes, and sign up for our newsletter. Leave us a message with your provocative question or your thoughtful comments. You might inspire a future episode of the License to Lead podcast. Thanks so much, everyone.